Hey guys, we are back updating the power rankings for the Traitors US Season 3 following the second batch of episodes, or Episode 4. And this is a really fun episode with a really fun outcome, a lot of crazy turns and events, and plenty of changes to the ranking, but we'll get to that soon enough. But we have 19 players to talk about, and as always, more time, let's go into the video. So starting off at number 19, we have the first boot from this episode, and here we have Jeremy Collins, who was sadly murdered in this episode, which was pretty unfortunate considering that he was one of the bigger names on the season, and considering that I did kind of have him high on my last week's power ranking, so I ended up being wrong there. Now I will say that within the episode, it did make it clear by the end that Jeremy was going home, especially with Carolyn's confessional during the breakfast, talking about how she didn't want to murder this particular person, and I feel like it gave away that it was Jeremy, as who else could she have been talking about there? So I feel like to that end, Jeremy's murder was kind of telegraphed. And I do think Jeremy was a pretty interesting player in the season. He was one of the main people to clock Danielle Reyes from early on as being a traitor. And obviously that while that led to his downfall in the sense that he made it too obvious that he was targeting Danielle, I still think Jeremy is a pretty strong player and someone who definitely could have done well had he been allowed to continue, but obviously he's now out of the game to where he's here at number 19. Now moving on to number 18, and we have the other boot from this episode, and here we have Bob the Drag Queen. Now, I said last week that I was pretty certain Bob was going to lose the game, that we already saw so many of his flaws on display in the first week, that it really was just a matter of time before he was going to get caught and taken out of the game. Though I will also say that I wasn't expecting it to come this soon, where I thought he would at least last a couple more episodes before eventually being caught, but instead we see him really falling victim to Boss Rob's scheme here, where he obviously makes a big mistake during the mission that results in Boss Rob wanting to target Bob the Drag Queen here. And it made for a really fun episode, just seeing Rob pulling together the numbers to really take him out here, and it led to a very explosive roundtable, which is all pretty fun. And I felt like by the end, it was pretty clear that this was going to be Bob's end, that Rob was going to be successful in this ploy to take him out. And sure enough, Bob is taken out, and it gets to reveal that he's a traitor, which was also a interesting reveal. And again, I feel like Bob was one of the bigger characters from these early batch of episodes, definitely one of the more interesting traitors of the bunch so far, even though I felt like he was deeply flawed with him being just way too active, and it really was just a matter of time before he got exposed, and sure enough, he made an enemy out of Boston Rob, and Boston Rob decided to turn the game on him. So I found his downfall here pretty satisfying, even though it was earlier than what I expected, but obviously he's now out of the game to where he's here at number 18. And with that, we have 17 people left again to talk about, and as usual, of ranking them based on how lucky I think they are to win the game based on their edit and current game position. But number 17, the person I believe is the least likely to win from this point on, is still Bob Harper. And I feel like this episode was more the same for Bob in the sense that we still aren't really getting that much for him outside of missions. It really feels like he's getting the bare minimum amount of content to be shown here, where the only highlight to come from him is during the roundtable where after Alan says that the time for deliberation is over, he just randomly drops an F-bomb out of nowhere, and Alan just tells him to shut up, which I found pretty funny. But beyond that, we also see Bob getting some sus on him, where now Dylan is starting to see him as a potential target moving forward. And the fact that Bob is getting such minimal content, the fact that he is such a non-entity on the show to where we don't really know what he's doing in the game, mixing in the fact that he already has sus on him is a really bad sign for me. I feel like Bob is still someone who I'm not looking at as a likely winner, and while he's not likely to be the next boot, as we see Dylan and Boston Rob talking about how they want to hold off for a little bit, I still have no confidence that he's going to go on to win the game by the end of it, which is why he's here at number 17. Now moving on to number 16, and we have another person in a similar boat to Bob, and here we have Kiara. And Kiara is someone who I'm also not feeling that great about. Now, she obviously got a bit more to do in this episode, but even then, that was mostly circumstantial content, where she ended up being one of the shortlisted players for murder early on, and obviously got content through that. And we see her being a target through this, where the traitors have planned to plant the seeds that one of the traitors would intentionally plant one of their own into the coffins to throw off the scent there. And obviously that plays out the round table where Derek was targeting her. That's not a great look there. I don't feel like she defends herself particularly well during that situation either. And I feel like Kiara is still someone I'm not really that invested in. I feel like the show isn't really propping her up nearly as much as she probably should have. And I feel like mixing in the fact that she also has sus on her and will probably continue to be a target moving forward, these are not great signs in my eyes. Now I could say that the fact that they got out of Traitor in this past round by actually taking out Bob the Drag Queen instead could lighten the load a little bit, as now there's less pressure to get a traitor out, but I still feel like Kiara's still someone who the traitors will be looking at to target at some point, using the whole shortlisting as a scapegoat to make her seem like a traitor. So because of that, I still have her here at number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and we have another person who I'm pretty confident is not winning, and here we have Lord Ivar. Now Lord Ivar just kind of got nothing in this episode. He didn't really have that much to do, and through that you could say that he should be higher as he didn't really get much negative content. But at the same time, I feel like it just carries over the perceptions I had from him before, where it seems like he's not really connecting that well with a lot of the house, it seems. And while he is part of the plan to banish Bob the drag queen at the end, I feel like he's still not someone I'm looking at that highly. I feel like this episode didn't really change my view of him, despite him seeming like he could be this interesting character. So it's for those reasons I still have him here at number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and we have someone very similar to Lord Ivar, and here we have Sam. And who is Sam? I mean, he is still one of the most under-edited players on the season so far, still not receiving a single confessional outside of missions, which I find pretty funny there. And in general, he's not really someone I'm looking at that highly. He's just kind of a non-entity for me. And while I probably have more faith in him inherently compared to Lord Ivar, at the same time, I feel like he's still not someone that the show is taking that seriously. He's really just an afterthought at the end of the day, and probably not a likely winner, which is why he's here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we have someone who I still remain pretty low on after this episode, and here we have Gabby. And Gabby's probably gotten the most consistent edit out of the people we talked about so far, where she's at least being shown on the show. However, I feel like the content we've gotten from her is not particularly great. Or first up, you have her walking into the bookcase area where the other traitors are, and for a moment seemed like she was on the right track to figure out that Danielle could be one of the traitors, but then she just immediately buys the arguments that the traitors are selling, noting how there are other people in the area. She even says in confessional that glad that got debunked, that Danielle could be a traitor, so I feel like that's not a great look. You even have Danielle dunking on her, talking about how she is just a Bambi and that she's just there to be cute. And I feel like a lot of Gabby's actions really reinforce that. So I feel like that's not particularly great. And then you also have her pretty openly admitting that she's biased and wanting to defend Nikki, saying that even if she is a traitor, she's not ready to say goodbye to Nikki, and that is her double standard, which I feel like is not the greatest look there. Or even though it's not inherently wrong to want a traitor in the game, even after you figure them out, the fact that she is claiming that she is just doing this for emotional reasons is probably not the greatest look there. I feel like she's not really taking it from a game approach. In general, I feel like Gabby's just coming off as more of a dodo, not really someone I'm looking at that highly. And it doesn't seem like the other players are taking her that seriously either. And on top of that, she also has sus in her now, where now Dylan is talking about how she could be a traitor. And there are even other people talking about how Gabby could be this potential target down the road. So in general, I feel like Gabby's in a pretty bad spot, and I feel like the edit isn't doing her any favors to where she's here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have another player who I'm not feeling the greatest about, even though they still got some content here, and here we have Dolores. Now, I did consider putting Dolores a little bit higher, considering she did seem to believe that Bob the drag queen was in fact a traitor, and was willing to go along with the plan by the end of it. But we also get content of her kind of shooting down the plan before the round table, where we had that conversation with her and Dylan, talking about how she believes Dylan, but kind of tries to discourage him from going after Bob the drag queen there, and saying how if he misses, then he'll be murdered tonight, which on paper isn't the worst thing from a pure game perspective, considering there is reason to want to ensure that there's numbers first before taking a shot. And sure enough, it's not even Dylan that takes the first shot there. It's more so Boston Rob. And it's through Boston Rob, like, taking the bullets that really allows Dylan and Dolores to later jump onto the plan. But the fact that Dolores, like, is shown shooting down a plan probably doesn't paint her in the best light, doesn't really show her as being, like, that active of a player. And the fact that she doesn't get to backup review and confessional, the fact that she doesn't really get any confessionals in this episode outside of missions, is probably not the greatest look there either. Like, it would be one thing if she said in confessional that she is, like, trying to take a more methodical approach, a more patient approach to playing the game. But the fact that we don't really see this from Dolores, the fact that we just see her talking about how she shouldn't take the shot, and then we later see Dylan and Rob being celebrated for taking the traitors out and sort of going against what Dolores wants. Probably not the greatest look there either. And the fact that beyond that, she's kind of under-edited, where outside the premiere, she doesn't really get that much to do. These are all pretty big knocks from me, and a reason why she isn't higher in the list. And while I could still see there being potential for her to move up as the season goes along, I feel like those things are enough to drag her down to number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have someone who I'm a bit disappointed is as low as they are, but at the end of the day, they are still pretty under-edited, and here we have Britney Haynes. And I'm a bit disappointed that Britney is as low as she is, but at the end of the day, she is still by far the most under-edited player from the big three, Survivor, Big Brother, and The Challenge, which in itself is pretty disappointing. The fact that we aren't seeing more of Britney, despite her being this bigger draw, and probably should be a bigger knock for Britney compared to some other under-edited players, where obviously with Survivor and Big Brother players, you would expect them to get big edits inherently due to them being big draws for the people that watch the show. So the fact that Britney isn't even getting that despite having that advantage coming into the season of being this Big Brother player is probably a massive knock to her. And I feel like at this point, I'm not feeling that great that she'll actually win the game. Where really the only advantage to her is that there's a chance that she could win this battle against Danielle, where there is set to this rivalry between Danielle and Britney through reindeer games. And there's a shot that Britney gets the upper hand here, especially with all the flaws that we've seen Danielle exhibit so far. So I feel like that's at least something holding Britney together. But beyond that, I feel like even other people are getting more of the credit for catching on to Danielle. So the fact that Britney isn't getting more of that herself is also a pretty big knock there, and a reason why she is all the way down here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and there's definitely debate for this person being lower, if I'm being honest, as this person did technically move up from last week, despite them not getting the greatest episode in the world. But we do have Robin. And the thing is, I still don't think Robin's that great of a player at the end of the day. And there's definitely a debate for her being lower, especially below Britney Haynes. But I think the one thing I will say about Robin is that she does at least mention the notion that the traitors could have planted one of their own into the coffins during the twist to throw out the twist, which obviously is inaccurate and obviously is like this deception that the traitors are trying to employ to throw the faithfuls off. But the fact that Robin gets to talk about it, it's at least something. Like, I do think it makes her come off at least a little aware and observant, like thinking about the game a little bit. But beyond that, I feel like she's still not the greatest player there. She obviously thinks that Kiara is one of the traitors, sort of falling into that trap. And at the end of the day, she's still not someone I'm looking at as that likely of a winner. And if anything, you can argue that her getting as much content as she is could be a sign that she could be booted relatively soon, either as a murderer or as someone that the traitors are framing. But at the end of the day, I feel like she at least has some potential to become a major character in the season, whereas I feel like the people we already talked about are either under-edited or people who have more blatant holes in their edit and more blatant negativity in their edit compared to Robin, which is why I am willing to leave her around the middle of the list here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we are finally arriving at our first traitor on the board, and here we have Danielle Reyes. And this episode just felt like more of the same here, where we are starting to see more of Danielle's flaws, we are starting to see her getting more sus, and obviously this was not a great round for her gameplay-wise either, where first up, she is very insistent on murdering Jeremy here, where obviously you have the fact that Jeremy is onto her and obviously is starting to spread around the fact that she could be a traitor, but the fact that she goes along with this murder here is kind of sloppy play in my eyes. The fact that she takes out someone who is directly targeting her just is something that should inherently put a ton of sus on her. Like the fact that she just murders like the number one person targeting her just comes off as really awkward here. And while we don't really see it play out in this episode, where she's not really a direct target in this round, we are still seeing people talking about her as a potential target, people like Nikki, for instance. And on top of that, we are seeing Danielle continuing to be sloppy, where during the breakfast, we have her asking tons of questions about the footsteps that the traitor was making, which obviously causes more stress to be put on her. And again, I really just feel like it's a matter of time before she eventually gets caught here. Not to mention that she ends up losing Bob the Drag Queen as early as she does. Doesn't want that to go through, but is kind of forced to vote for Bob the Drag Queen at the point where Rob leads his resistance to take him out there. And obviously there's going to be some beef. Who knows how well she's going to be able to handle that, whether she'll try to target Rob next as retaliation. That would be something at least. But in turn, I just don't think Danielle's winning this game. I feel like we're already seeing so many people have sus on her. And the same thing last week with Bob the Drag Queen, where we saw people starting to be suspicious of him, namely Dylan. And obviously we saw how quickly that turned around on him. And I can very easily see Danielle having the same fate here, where she either digs her own grave by continuing to do things that causes sus to come her way, or she ends up burning Rob through her anger at the Bob the Drag Queen vote out that eventually causes Rob to decide to turn a game on her as well. I just don't feel that great about Danielle actually winning the game at this point, which is why she's here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have someone who I just mentioned, but we do have Boston Rob. And again, I feel like this is more the same from last week, where I talked a lot about how I just don't think Boston Rob inherently is likely to win this game, simply due to how massive of a name he is, considering how big of a target he is right at the bat. And while he could be used as a shield for a bit, he's still someone who is very unlikely to get to the very end of the game. And I feel like we saw that on display this week, where he obviously does make this pretty massive move in flipping the game on Bob the Drag Queen, seemingly due to Bob the Drag Queen throwing him under the bus during the mission there. And you can definitely debate over whether this was the correct move for Boston Rob or not. Now, I will say that for players not Boston Rob, this is 100% the wrong move. I feel like it's a move that brings a lot of attention to yourself. It's a move that could easily backfire if you miss your shot by sowing distrust within the traders. It's a move that puts a lot of attention towards you to where people would expect you to be murdered down the road due to you being this reliable trader catcher. And obviously, since you can't be murdered, it obviously will just create a situation where people will wonder why you aren't being murdered round after round. I feel like that's not great. It also puts you in a spot to where you'll eventually have to cough up another trader, and through that, that could also sow distrust with the other traders, make them think that they're about to turn on you as well. So I think there's a lot of risks inherently with a move like this, but I think for someone like Boston Rob in particular, I just don't think it's that bad considering he's already unlikely to win anyway. He's probably someone that people are already suspecting of being a traitor. And through him making this big move and actually outing a traitor pretty early on, it does build him some credibility in the house. And through that, he is starting to be trusted a bit more. Though at the same time, we also saw seeds at the end of the episode that people are starting to catch on to him. People like Wes, for instance, are seeing him as someone that could be a traitor due to how confidently he spoke during the roundtable there. And on top of that, you also have the contract with Dylan, where he talks in confessional after the roundtable about how his plan is to take Dylan deeper into the game, using the bother jacking round to build trust with Dylan, build an alliance with him, drag him to the game, and then cut Dylan at the end. Where if we are to believe that Dylan is the main protagonist of the season, being this foil to Boston Rob, then it stands to reason that Dylan will eventually catch on and take out Boston Rob instead. So I feel like there's a lot of stuff on the show already that's pointing to Boston Rob potentially being cut down the road, on top of the fact that he is just inherently unlikely to win a season like this anyway. But at the end of the day, I still feel like he is being shown more positively than someone like Danielle, for instance, where I feel like with Danielle, there's already way more red flags that Danielle is going to be caught down the road. And just from a game perspective, I think Boston Rob is making the most out of his situation here and trying to make big moves and trying to ingratiate himself the best he can to counter these perceptions of him. But at the end of the day, I still think it's very unlikely to actually work by the end of it, which is why he's here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and I'm actually surprised this person is as high as they are, but I feel like this was actually a decent episode for them considering the circumstances. But we actually have Nikki. And Nikki obviously had an interesting episode here where she was shortlisted for murder, and obviously had a target on that through her being part of that twist where people thought she was a traitor afterwards. And obviously she did have a target on her back coming to that roundtable where the likes of Wes was pretty convinced that she was a traitor there. And obviously she does end up surviving that round, but I will say that Nikki actually gets pretty decent content considering these circumstances, where I feel like she is being kind of set up as this underdog figure where you have her whole speech during the twist where she says that she is going to be an asset in missions, and even as a confessional talking about how the traders mess with the wrong person and how there's no more Miss Nice Nikki. And obviously while a lot of that is circumstantial content and could just be that, I feel like Nikki also had some decent content in her premiere that makes me a bit more confident in her than someone like Kiara, who is also in a similar situation. But on top of that, you also have her starting to catch on in the game, where you have her being one of the main people looking at Danielle as a potential target, where she talked about how Jeremy was someone that she sad to lose, and how Jeremy told her about how he was close to Danielle and how she's starting to pick up those signs there. So I think there's definitely setup to Nikki potentially playing a major role in getting Danielle out of the game at some point. So I feel like that's a pretty major pro for her. And even with her having a target on her back, I feel like by the end of the episode, I feel like the target has kind of subsided to where Wes, one of the biggest people that was targeting her at the round table, instead now is his eyes sets on Boston Rob after the episode. So I feel like through that, that definitely gives Nikki a bit of safety in the game, and through that, I could definitely see her advance in the game as a result there. And with her still being a suspected traitor due to her involvement in the twist, I could see the traders want to keep her safe for a few more rounds as well, which obviously ties into Kiara as well. But I still feel like Nikki is still someone who I'm looking at as a potential contender here, both from a game perspective, but also from an edit perspective. I feel like there's definitely some setup to a storyline there with Nikki. But still, I feel like there are other people that have more setup compared to her, which is why she's here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have someone who I was a bit higher on compared to other people, but they obviously jumped up a bit due to other people going down. But number 6, we do have Tom Sandoval, and I think Tom still has that potential that I talked about last week, where he obviously has a setup relationship with Chelle, and through that there's this potential for them to turn things around. Though I will say that this was also a cool down episode for him as well, where we don't really get that much focus on them, where instead his main focus comes with him thinking that Kiara is a traitor due to the twist there. And obviously he does end up voting for Nikki by the end of it due to him thinking that one of the traitors was one of the people that was locked in the coffins there. Though at the same time, he does kind of turn around by the end of it, where he is part of the conversation with Wes, talking about how Raw could be a traitor there, and Tom did seem to be on board with that. So I feel like that's something that kind of saves him as well. The fact that he is kind of part of this movement that's picking up on an actual traitor, having sus on them. So I think that's definitely a pro going for Tom as well. And with him not really being as prominent in the edit, I feel like there's definitely an argument for him being lower. But I still think the fact that there's still some potential there based on how his week 1 went and some positivity here and there in his episode 4, it was definitely enough to have him around the same spot at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and sadly this person has moved down compared to last week, as I feel like this episode wasn't that great for them, and here we have Derek Levasseur. And obviously the major knock to Derek is he is the main person going after Kiara in this episode, where he really leads the effort in targeting her, really buying into the traitors theory that one of the traitors is one of the people that was shortlisted for murder there. And we see him like going all in on targeting Kiara. And obviously he's just wrong here. And obviously that's a pretty big knock there. And the fact that he doesn't really get a follow-up to this after the roundtable is obviously not the greatest look there. Now, it's not a death nail per se, as obviously Derek could still turn things around by the end of it. And obviously with him being a competent player from Big Brother, I think there's definitely some potential there as well. But at the same time, like I feel like this is still a pretty bad look for Derek to be blatantly wrong, especially when he's using his police credentials to make arguments in favor of Kiara being banished. I feel like those things are enough to knock him down to number 5. Now moving on to number 4, we kind of have a similar player, and here we have Wes. And I feel like Wes is kind of on a similar boat to Derek in the sense that he is spending a decent amount of the episode targeting the wrong person, buying into the traitor's theory that one of the traitors is one of the people in the coffins, where for Wes, he thinks Nikki is the traitor and really rides that train during a lot of the round. He ends up voting for Nikki at the end, which is obviously not particularly great. However, I think something saving Wes here, and the reason why he's above Derek, is he at least kind of changes his mind by the end of it. He sort of realizes the error of his ways after the round table and starts to look at Rob as a potential traitor there, sort of noting how confident Rob was speaking during the round table, and also the fact that he recognized that one of the people that entered the game late is a traitor, and obviously that leaves Rob as a potential option there. So I feel like that was enough to have Wes above Derek in my eyes. And on top of that, I think he is still someone getting a pretty consistent presence as a result there. But I still think there's enough knocks to leave him behind at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and you could definitely argue this person is too high. However, I still think compared to other people, there's definitely a lot of potential for this person there. And here we have Chelle. And Chelle obviously is someone who I did note last week as someone who could have this potential storyline, particularly with her relationship with Tom. That was obviously a major focus during the first batch of episodes. And while it wasn't really a focus this week, I still think Chelle got decent enough content in this episode where we got a check from her early on, talk about the Bambies and how she can't bear to see Nikki getting murdered, which obviously leads to Nikki staying. You obviously have her defending Nikki during the roundtable and being on board to vote up Bob the Drag Queen, which is all pretty good. Now, admittedly, this wasn't the most visible episode for Chelle in the world, but she still got a check-in. Like, it's not as if she got nothing there. We got the reminder that she has his relationship with the Bambies, and I feel like out of the Bambies, Chelle is by far like the most developed, seeming to be the most competent player of that 3 outside of maybe Nikki. So I feel like those are major pros going for her, and with me still feeling like I'm a bit higher on her compared to other people, that was enough to have her here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and this is someone who I was obviously pretty high on last week, and I feel like this episode did more of the same here. By number 2, we do have Dylan, and obviously Dylan is a major character in this season. I think the first batch of episodes made that pretty clear. In this past episode also made it pretty clear that Dylan is going to be one of the bigger players on this season, where he does successfully suss out Bob the Drag Queen. He is sort of a secondary figure in targeting Bob the Drag Queen, where it seemed like the main reason he was going after him in this particular round was due to having Boston Rod's backing there. And sure enough, he does build credibility in the house after Bob the Drag Queen gets taken out, where people are now looking at him as his credible traitor catcher, which is all pretty good. And I feel like Dylan is definitely going to play a major role in the season moving forward. You also have him sort of fitting like this archetype of this perfect faithful, someone who is picking up the game as he goes along while still like playing as a faithful. Though I think at the same time, I think something holding me back from having him at number 1 is one, the fact that he's overexposed. I think he is getting a ton of content very early on, which in general is probably not the greatest sign of him going on to win the game, especially from a faithful perspective. But I also think on top of that, with the way that his story is going, especially with the fact that we see the episode end with him aligning with Boston Rob, I think there is like this tragic story starting to build up with Dylan where I could see him eventually being recruited as a traitor by Boston Rob down the road, and through that he starts to like evolve his approach to the game. Where obviously a major focus of him on the season is that he is like picking up the game, getting better as he goes along. And I think the natural evolution of that is him evolving into a traitor, coming off as his faithful, really like using the faithful perception in order to play a traitor style of game. And while that could be good in the sense that he has longevity and be a major focus on the season, I think it also leads to a downfall at the very end, where someone like Dylan is probably going to be cut right before the end, maybe get a bit too big for his britches, perhaps. Or maybe someone like Nikki comes along and snipes him out there. I think there's a lot of warning signs that Dylan could have this downfall down the road, this villainous turn down the road, or just a general downfall, or maybe Boston Rob tries to target him down the road or something like that. Maybe realizes that's maybe not the right move to take Dylan so deep into the game. And then on top of that, you have Boston Rob even admitting that he's not going to take Dylan to the end of the game, even if Boston Rob like is able to stay true to that. When while that could lead to Dylan like being the one to take out Boston Rob, and the reason why Boston Rob is lower, I still think Dylan is still someone who I'm not getting the greatest sense from, and I could definitely see like this villain story playing out for him there. But it's still the fact that he is a major character in the season and definitely has more pros for him compared to other people that leaves him relatively high on the list to where he's here at number 2. And now at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win the Traitors US Season 3 is still Carolyn Weiger. Now, admittedly, in a lot of ways, I'm sort of similar to how I view Carolyn at this point compared to how I viewed her early on in Survivor 44, where I think Carolyn is still getting pretty solid content. Like, she is still a major character on the season. She is probably the most sympathetic figure of the traitors so far. And this is despite her not getting her way, where she is once again steamrolled during the murder, where she doesn't want to murder Jeremy, but is kind of forced into agreeing to that. And then on top of that, you have her being very uneasy with the plan to take out the drag queen. And sort of similar to Danielle, is kind of like forced into voting him out at the point where the rest of the group turns against him there. So I feel like Carolyn's still kind of in the same spot as last week, where she's getting very positive content. She's being shown as a very sympathetic figure, and it's probably the least likely traitor to be caught, as obviously that's another major pro for her as well. But it's still kind of a weird situation where she's still not getting her way there. And we obviously saw in Survivor 44 that eventually she got overtaken by Jam Jam and eventually went on to be a losing finalist. And I can see a world where Carolyn has a similar fate, where maybe she gets towards the end of the game, but is just unable to actually squeak out the win by the end of it. Maybe she gets caught along the way. Maybe she just kind of like fails to find some people that actually want to take her to the end of the game. So I think that's definitely some worry signs there. But I feel like compared to someone like Dylan, for instance, I feel like there's less obvious signs of a downfall. Where I feel like Dylan, there's just so many red flags for me that he is eventually going to have like this villainous arc and this downfall at the very end of the game. I feel like Carolyn is someone I still don't quite see that as much as others. Though truth be told, I could definitely see her moving down in future weeks. And I could see someone like a Chelle or even a Nikki sort of surprise the people and sort of jump on the power rankings as a result. But I feel like for now, considering the evidence we currently have, I'm still going to leave Carolyn number 1, even though there's definitely some worry signs for her down the road, which is why she's still here at number 1. And there we go. That'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. Really helps out with the channel. Now we'll be back again next week to update the power rankings again, so you can look forward to that. I'm still doing Hell's Kitchen power rankings as the new episodes come out, so you can expect those as well. I'm on Patreon and have a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that is the video. See ya.